end of the day. I'd like to have just a little bit of conversation between the two of you. Derek, would you like to have Natalie? I saw you writing, and so.
I was writing, yeah. I loved that. The statistic that struck me about the last point that you made about the need for consistent mobilization, it just rings so true, because I do think that a lot of young people, certainly before the 2016 election, sort of treated politics like they treat movies, that they waited for the blockbusters and they went to like the presidential elections. But like in midterms, nope. In local elections, the median age for a mayoral election in the United States today is 61 years old. That means the typical mayoral voter was born right smack in the middle of the second Eisenhower administration, which, you know, is a fine time to be born. But like, there's a lot of decades after that people had occasion to be born as well, and, and so many decades to vote in. And I wonder, you know, do you believe that? Do you sometimes look at the Trump administration and the passion that has been galvanized among young people to follow politics now? And do you see like a small silver lining in that like this is a generation that needed, or maybe a country that needed a moment, a wake up call?
Yeah, I agree with you on your first point. I think that before this election, for a lot of young people, politics was a spectator sport. It was like you said, we wanted to go when we saw like the sexiest, most entertaining thing that was happening. But in reality, on November 8th, only 50% of millennials even participated in voting at all. And I think what I've realized is exactly what you're saying, is that this election, and not just like the day of the election, but the campaign, everything, what's happened afterwards has just been such a wake-up call, especially for young people, because I think for a lot of young people, this was maybe their first, second, or third time voting. And the times before, a lot of people were either very active, or other people said somebody else is taking care of it, like the group mentality. If it's everyone's job, it's no one's job. And I wouldn't love to say that it was a good thing, the things that are going on, because they have been very discouraging. But I will say that in this happening, I do believe a lot more good is going to come out of it. I do believe that it was such a wake-up call for our generation to say, if you want to have you don't get to see this election happen and then be pissed off about it and complain to everyone on social media for 4 years, because we had a play in making this election happen. We had a stay in what happened because we either showed up or we didn't show up. And so I think it's redistributing the power, or just the education, I think, of the awareness of your participation or your lack of participation is a vote. It is participation. And for people to now are waking up, so many people seeing, okay, so if I act, then I get to have a part in the outcome. And maybe the outcome still won't be what you intended, but I think it's just waking young people up to what engagement means and how often you have to engage, and what our role is in society. And I think that also plays a big part with school. Like, I know after I graduated, I went through AP government, all that kind of stuff, and still the idea of our elections and, you know, all this, it was confusing for me. So for me, I think it has to start so much younger, of how we're telling young people to engage on a regular basis in your community, in my local elections in Los Angeles, showing up so I know who my councilwoman is, you know. And but I do agree with you. I think it was an incredible wake-up call, and now everyone's playing catch-up. Young people, at least, are playing catch-up. And I think for me, it's wanting to help young people to know how to distribute their energy. So if we're going to have all this energy bottled up, how are you going to distribute it in a productive, safe way, to where we're not going and discriminating against somebody else just because you're angry and you feel like you're right, but doing it in a productive way?
So I know
actually have another question.
Okay.
Is that all right? May I,
all right.
I'll try to play
okay.
moderator.
Okay, go ahead.
So I was thinking about this as you were talking, that that Max Planck quote, science proceeds by one funeral after another. The extended quote is sort of interesting when thinking about social movements, because he says, one does not, this is a bastardization of the quote, but it's something like this. One does not convince the world of a scientific truth through persuasion. One waits for the generation of previous scientists to die, and then the generation that grows up understanding that idea turns it into scientific truth. And this is a weird point to make maybe at a conference on longevity, but here we go. I'm interested in your theory of persuasion, because one theory of persuasion is people aren't persuaded. People have made up their mind, they've made up their moral truths, and those moral truths are bedrock. And you just have to wait. If you want to defeat them, you simply have to wait many decades for them to no longer exist. But morality is sometimes too urgent for that. It needs time. And I wonder what your theory of persuasion is.
Yeah, I will be concise. I agree with you. I think in my history as a speaker, I've studied all of that. I tried, what does the persuasion look like as a speaker? What are the different tactics of storytelling? I'm also a film producer, so storytelling to me is one of the most powerful tools, narrative tools of creating understanding. And at a time I worked in Rwanda, I lived in Rwanda working in the midst of this reconciliation seminars of people who were perpetrators and victims of the Rwandan genocide. And these reconciliation seminars, it was so fascinating for me what I learned there and wanting to try to apply it, especially to the work I do with racial reconciliation here in the States and giving young people a voice on how do you communicate about racial reconciliation. And so much about it was, instead of this idea of persuasion, it was this concept of understanding. How do we create understanding amongst people? And I think it's what you had mentioned briefly in your talk as well about, I'm not going to be able to, somebody who has never lived on the south side of Chicago, has never been sat down regularly with with my family, who has never gone to my church, who has never seen the issues that we face, it's going to be so difficult for them to understand, and they come with their own narrative, with their own experience, with their own preconceived notions and conditioning. And so I understand that we all have different conditioning, and I think that the idea of persuasion, of me abruptly coming to you and saying, I'm right, you're wrong, and I'm going to convince you because I'm smarter than you and more eloquent, is never going to work. I think that it's about creating safe spaces where you can come honestly and say, I come from a different background than you. I am different than you. You are different than me. I have respect for you. I know that we have different views, but can I sit and tell you my story so you understand more of me and the type of people that I come from and the community I come from, and I will listen and reciprocate the same respect to you. And I think it's more about creating a safe space, a disarming space where people can come and we don't have to lie and pretend that we share the same beliefs. We can honestly say, I totally disagree with you, but I want to understand you as a human. So I think it's about creating human connections instead of this abrasive dialogue in persuasion. And so that's why I believe storytelling is so powerful, and I teach and train young people on how do you empathetically tell your story and empathetically listen to other people's stories to create understanding versus persuasion. So.
Thank you. Do you want to ask Derek anything before I open to the audience?
Oh man, I feel like we need to sit over a cocktail.
You don't have to. I think there's questions, but I just want
This is actually straightforward.
to be a good moderator.
Mine is, at least.
Oh my God, so many questions. My question is how, when you're talking about this dream, diverse, egalitarian world, when you talk to people, I come against this oftentimes when I'm talking to people about, because I am a positive person. I obviously have negative views on some things, but I do believe more in the hopeful side of things. How, when you are up against a lot more pessimists and people who are just outright disagree with you and disagree with the backings that you have, how do you express this idea, or I guess the need that we have in order to see this longevity of society, more healthy society, and this is where you see it going? How do you explain that to people who completely just disagree?
I don't, or at least I fail to. I do think very fundamentally that people sort of have bedrock principles that anchor their perception of the world, and it's very difficult to change those. And my brief theory of persuasion is always to convince people that I am right for the reasons that they already knew. Mm-hmm. Sort of like the principle that you've already had actually somewhat leads to my conclusion if you can see it from my perspective. So you don't actually even have to change your mind or admit that you're wrong, but we can somehow come to a certain understanding. When it comes to multiculturalism, let's say, sort of diversity, I'm reminded of the idea that I think the most fundamental bias in human nature is the bias toward familiarity. people are biased toward familiar everything. We're biased toward the food that we ate as children, the music that we listened to in our teens, the movies that we fell in love with when we were going on our first dates. We even there's lots of evidence that seems to suggest that our political inclinations seems to crystallize between the late teens and early 20s, during college and just after. So if you're a Republican by 31, you're almost certainly going to be a Republican by 71 or 121. We'll see, you know, how far this goes. And as a result, it becomes very difficult the downside of that, the dark side, is it's difficult to persuade someone who's already decided decades ago what they believe. But a bias toward familiarity means that people are unbelievably sensitive to early conditions in their lives, and extremely sensitive to media impressions as well when they're exposed to them over and over and over again. If you look at this country's attitude toward gay marriage, this is an issue that Barack Obama could not say running for re-election. He still couldn't say that he supported gay marriage. It took loudmouth Joe Biden to accidentally say that this was a merely cynical political position, and then Obama eventually had to come out and say, no, I am okay with gay marriage itself and not just civil unions. Just imagine how absurdly quickly this issue went from being absolute, like, heterodox craziness to being one of the most obvious issues certainly among sort of the center and left of center American communities. And I think that one incredibly important element there is that you had lots of representations of gay people in movies, in theater, Normal Heart, Angels in America, and in television with Will and Grace and other broadcast comedies that exposed lots and lots of Americans who otherwise might not have thought that much about the legality of gay marriage, this idea that gay people could be just as funny and smart and stupid and silly and complexly human as all of their straight friends. And that I think that played an incredibly important role in the mainstreaming of that idea. And so I am optimistic because I suppose, like Dr. King, I too believe that the arc of justice is long, yet always bending toward the good. And our arc of history is long, but always bends toward justice, I think is...
You got there.
I got it. And I think that as society improves, young people are brought up in an ever more just world, I hope.
I agree.
Thank you. Thank you. I have a couple of, we're late, but we're going to have some questions. Please, go ahead.
A question for Natalie, but I'd be happy to hear, both of you on it if you have thoughts. I loved the fact that you're going back and studying SNCC. It certainly was the last time the country's been as divided as it is today. But I was struck thinking about that parallel because I lived through that. I was your age when that was going on. In the 60s, the violent radicalism arose out of the more kind of centrist, organized political activity. So, for example, the Weathermen were actually an outgrowth of the Students for a Democratic Society. So, and I don't know if SNCC had, violent, I don't remember. Were there differences? So it's almost as if in today's world, we've sprung immediately to, instead of having a period of kind of peaceful work that leads to a polarization, we've sprung immediately to the polarization with radicals on both sides, Nazis confronting Antifa.
I think for me, it was looking back and seeing what is a model that works, but again, adapting to the relevancy of our time now. And also saying, I think for me, when you talk to young people, I think that I always err against the side of saying that we're going to create something perfect that's going to work, because I think a lot of young people struggle so often with saying, well, if it's not going to be perfect, then I can't pursue it because so many people are going to judge it because it's all over social media. And so I think it's saying, what were the positive elements of SNCC that did work? Because I think for young people especially, they need a story, something, a historical context to attach something to say, oh, these were young people like me, even though the situation was more dire in many different elements and very different than the situations we're facing now, but being able for young people to attach something, to attach the story of this, to see young people, the same faces that look like them, that were students who are just as passionate, and saying, even as an example of SNCC, I don't think we should we should still pay attention to the things that they didn't get right. You know, how do we keep from being too extremely radicalized and then too passive? And I think nowadays, as you're saying, yes, there is a lot of polarization. There is so much extreme responses that so many people feel are the sides. And I think a lot of that is a result of just the digital age that we're in, the social media with everything happening so rapidly. And because of the digital age and being online, so many people feel like I have to be the loudest to be right, instead of saying maybe me sitting back and creating a good disarming persuasion. It's saying I just have to be loudest because somebody else is going to be loud and violent, so we have to do it too. And so I don't know if this is answering your question, but I think there is a benefit in looking at the positive and also looking at the negative to say, okay, where can we learn from that? I have thought long and hard and sought out civil rights leaders that I can sit down and ask, Harry Belafonte, different people, to say, what were the elements that were done right and what weren't done right that we can learn from, and how can we adapt that to our time now? And I think that is where the intergenerational approach comes. That's where I have to sit down with my mother and my grandmother and my father. My mom and dad are a black woman and a white man who grew up as young people in that time, and so they had two very different experiences, and seeing, you know, what does your wisdom and experience and knowledge tell me that I can adapt to our relevant, innovative approach? So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much, both of you, for the inspiration, for the ideas.
Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you.
All right, we went over. Oh, this is great. Thanks so much.